If you get in early, you win 50% of the time. But, most investors don't get in. They go in once it's hit realestate.com or it's on the front page of the Herald Sun, and that investor location is really good. And I think following those hotspots, they're not really where you should be investing.
Our motto is buy without regrets, and so
if you can buy a property that will serve you for 10 years as opposed to 3 years, that will serve you well. It's something.
Buying a great property today, that's not just what it's about. It's also getting something that could be ripe for improvement when the time is right for that investor or for the next buyer.
You think about, lifestyle, what's important to you? How do you get to work? What do you need for your family? What amenities like parks and shops? Then you look at the budget.
Welcome to Street Secrets. I'm Chris Bates. I'm a mortgage broker since 2013. And in this podcast, we're going to be interviewing Australia's leading buyers agents, ones with decades of experience, have the local insider knowledge on the street, and can really help you with your buying process, no matter whether you're a first home buyer, upgrader, investor. In this podcast, you'll get access to Australia's leading buyers agents' minds every week on a Thursday. What's the word on the street? Welcome to Street Secrets. I'm Chris Bates. Super excited to be doing another episode, going as south as we can go today, all the way to Tassie. David Zerna, how you doing?
Great to be here. Nice to chat all things property.
Good to chat, to a different side of the country. One of the most beautiful parts of the country, if you ask me, and if you're inside the car, but also outside the car is good when you've got the wineries and nature, and I absolutely love Tassie. So let's get stuck into it. I mean, people who don't know you, can you talk a bit about your history before you become a BA, how long you've been a BA for, and even just, how long you've been in Hobart for as well.
So I've been in Hobart for a bit over 20 years, relocated, as a 19-year-old. So it really was green moving into southern part of the state. We've been investing in property ourselves for about 17 years. So after a few years of relocating to Hobart, sort of bought our own property and started that property investing journey. Quite new to the rent vesting journey quite early as well. So that was a term not thought about, that long ago. So that was quite interesting. The southern part of the state, or Tasmania in general, is secluded and taken off the map in a lot of property discussions. The lifestyle, the food, the wine, is really on a global stage, and it's really exciting on that tourism space where the state sits. My background is really in sort of, corporate retail, customer service driven, was really where my skill set and leadership really took place originally. And that took me early stages up the east coast of Australia and living up there. And then obviously that pulled back to the southern part of the state where we sort of started to dive into property. Our buyers agency started just pre-COVID, 2019. We started to put the pieces of the puzzle together and really got a good understanding from our experience, for buying for, nearly 10 years prior, navigating different markets. And I think that's probably on a lot of people's tips of their tongue around Tasmania and Hobart and Launceston in general, is the different cycles we move in and the different key events that have happened in the last 20 years to really lift the state, I suppose, and then increase capital growth in a lot of property and increase those people's wealth alongside that. If you go back 15 years ago, we were in a bit of a glut. It was a tough market, 09 coming out of the GFC, 09, 10, 11 and 12, and 2013, we dropped by nearly 10% through that 12-month period in 2013. We had a wonderful visit from the Chinese president, Jinping, in 2015, and that really kicked off a real strong property boom in terms of population growth, private and public investment. And the famous Mona Museum, based here in Hobart, was really a key catalyst in driving that international flair to our state, and that flowed into the property prices and really opened up what we call the northern corridor in Hobart in terms of living and lifestyle for a lot of people. So that property growth really, I think medium house prices at that stage in 2015 were about $223,000. And through that 4-year period to 2019, they sort of doubled through that sort of 4 to 5 year period. And that was really based in the city, of Launceston, city of Hobart. That was where the growth really was. And navigating a lot of clients through those periods of time was quite great because it's city-based and jobs and facilities are close by. And then the COVID happened. And I think Tasmania were treated kindly compared to other states, Victoria in mind, we're treated kindly. We're on an island, good luck trying to get to us. We just cut off the boats and the planes and everything was great. And then, the flight to lifestyle and the relocation was extraordinary. And, a lot of our work was with clients relocating globally, Hong Kong, Singapore, Europe, and especially the south states of the US. We're relocating back to Hobart or to Launceston and the east coast of Tasmania through that COVID period. So a lot of owner-occupier driven for our business through that period of time. So that was really interesting. And a lot of our work was extensively working with clients' briefs and lifestyle and how they're going to work and connecting internet and, all these things that you don't think about. But as a buyer's agent, our role really is holistic role. How do they live their life, in the best outcome through the property that we purchase? So, yeah, that gives you another, a bit of a thought about where we are and, a bit of the history of our business too.
Yeah, let's talk about those cycles a bit, because I do think there's some markets, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to sort of figure out what's driving it. But I mean, if you sort of rewind back to that sort of 2010s, was it a lot of sort of the flight of people maybe just across the ditch from Melbourne, I can actually be around nature. I love that. I used to go on holidays there and, I'll take my Melbourne cash and get a lot more for my money. And, maybe a lot of there's a bit of a brain drain probably out of Tassie. People would go back the other way. They go to uni and then get for jobs, etc. But, how's that sort of shifted, to now? And, a lot more probably younger people have moved there and are probably continuing to move there. Is that sort of the major change you've seen?
Yeah, most definitely. When we look pre-COVID and that sort of 2010 to 2015, it's the jobs piece, really. That's the real interesting one. Through that 5-year period, the younger generation really had to get to the Melbourne, the Sydney and the Brisbane to blow up their careers and, increase that earning capacity. But it wasn't uncommon, in their 40s, they'd bring the family back and reside back, through Launceston, Hobart way. What we're seeing now post-COVID is stability in those age brackets. So the population growth continues to flow in, not enormous, but it sort of balances itself out year on year at the moment. But that exodus of that younger bracket isn't as happening to a higher volume as previous. And that's really around that jobs, accessibility, work from homes being a massive one. But that tourism piece, hospitality or manufacturing, that's really grown those jobs and really kept people here in the state. And we've seen that through the property price increase, which has been an interesting ride from 2015 to March 2022 was really the height of our property market there and balanced, moving forward from that point in time. So, yeah, it's been good. And I can see that probably continuing. You look at Sydney and Melbourne, you're looking at your global businesses and all those retailers and hospitality you want. Those things are available here. There's not a lot of difference. There's not much, maybe a big box retailer here and there, but outside of that, the facilities are available in each of the major cities here.
Obviously, the holiday at home, the COVID, people leaving just because they wanted to, travel, right? And people leaving the cities just because they can't afford to stay. But a lot of people have got on holidays to Tassie and gone, hang on a sec, this is going a little bit of a hidden gem, and people are still doing that, right? Like, do we want to go and travel the world or, and they've got sort of a bug for just exploring Australia? Do you find that that's just a huge part of, obviously the people moving back? I mean, I've got friends in that situation that, and then they've had the kids and they're like, hang on a sec, like I'm going home. It was such a good upbringing for me as a child. I'd just love to give that to my kids and also need some help and my parents are still there. But do you find that that's kind of been the catalyst as well? Like people have just wanted to explore Australia more and they've sort of sudden found Tassie.
Yeah, definitely. It's really surprising to the amount of clients that we work with who've been here once or twice. They might come through the summer period or for an event. And, they come for maybe the Wooden Boat Festival or they come through the December period for the Sydney to Hobart yacht race and they fall in love. Sydney, Melbourne siders and Brisbane, they're really ingrained in the lifestyle, the time that they get back in their life. And we work extensively with clients around that. The time they get back, we were talking the other day, it could be 6 to 15 hours a week they get back in terms of not traveling and not in the car. And they can spend, in a hobby or, with their family as well. So that's been a huge draw card. The next draw card, I think, is climate. It's probably been on the tip of everyone's tongue in the last 6 to 12 months. So, Western Australians and country New South Wales, country Queensland, that temperature is sort of getting scorching hot, especially this time of year. And our cool climate really provides that stability and movability and being able to get outdoors and enjoy the pristine lifestyle that we really have. So they're probably the two biggest things out of the draw card is the time piece. And it's funny, we work with a lot of clients, they might move to Launceston, let's say Lonnie is a good one as an example, it's a real vibrant city at the moment. And they will go, oh, it's fine. We're happy to live an hour out of town. And I'm like, oh yeah, okay. Like, yeah, I get that. that, that's okay. But an hour out of Launceston is like 2 hours out of Sydney. So let's say you're in Newcastle and you're just traveling every day. Is that the life you still want to live? And so that education piece, we bring, we fly them down and we will pick them up and we'll tour them around these areas to give them that real intricacy of the lifestyle.
I mean, every boom is driven by owner-occupiers, but it's also driven when the investors jump on board as well. If you sort of, maybe not your clients, but, the investors are a huge part of Hobart, right? Like some of them are, very long-term buy and hold, and they're just looking for good assets they're going to hold for 30, 40 years. I mean, that's the type of we work with. And then you get the buyers agents that are sort of just going to the next hotspot and hit the market. Like, where has that really burnt, some of those investors that have maybe just chased the bream? If they got early, that's different, right? Like, it's been very hard to, rising tide to lift all ships. And, and if they didn't sell at the top, well, they had a lot of gains, so that didn't really matter. But where have they sort of got it wrong a little bit, where they've applied different logic and maybe not what the locals wanted, given that you've been there for 20 years, that?
That's a good one. Like 80% of our client book is investors, week in, week out. And it's something we work with quite extensively. And it's the local on the ground knowledge and the street analysis that really brings investors to life in choosing that right asset or right property that they're going to purchase and in line with their goals. What we see other people in our profession, who aren't on the ground and their experience isn't extensive over 20 years, is our cities don't gentrify at the same speed bigger cities do. And so, when we're talking about gentrification, maybe in a Sydney or Melbourne, that suburb can gentrify in 7 to 10 years. We're talking 25 to 50 years. It's extreme numbers to think about, but they don't gentrify. The government doesn't relocate social homes at a speed they do in other cities, and they don't need to do that because, we've got open land spaces in a lot of the CBD locations. And that's what we see a lot of people go wrong, if they don't have expertise and on the ground and street level knowledge, is they're buying in areas with the thought that are going to gentrify. And they're very, very low socioeconomic areas. And there is no long-term plan for governments to change those areas. There's no need for the governments to change those areas. And those investors are really getting hurt because of that lack of in-depth, on-the-ground, local knowledge. Like, we know where the families live. We know what the demands of some of these suburbs are on a day-to-day basis. We drive through them every single day. So it's really around knowing that, okay, the movement is slow into some of these waterfront locations. Yes, you're right. If you get in early, you win 50% of the time. But most investors don't get in. They go in once it's hit realestate.com or it's on the front page of the Herald Sun, and that investor location is really good. And I think following those hot spots, they're not spots in my mind. They're not really where you should be investing. For definitely the local knowledge, its lifestyle, suburban living is really strong, and then the city lifestyle is really strong. So, and they're different to a lot of other cities. So that lifestyle suburbia can be 15 minutes out of the city. It's on the waterfront. I can walk my dog across the river or around the river and really enjoy that lifestyle. We see investors definitely, if they're DIY, come to us after 6 to 12 months of trying to hunt and buy investment properties here. They just can't understand the landscape. They just don't understand why the price disparities, one to another, or the people movement in those areas, the quality and condition of property. We were a timber state for 50 years, 60 years. So since the sort of 1950s, we're a timber plantation state. So a lot of the houses are built in timber, and we've got uneducated investors can't understand why there's no brick and tile homes and that maintenance piece. So understanding the longer term mechanics of both our major cities is really important. And if you get it right, that coin, when you flip it, is extraordinary. You buy the right character and you buy the right street in the right suburb, that capital growth is, in our research, can be 2 to 3 points higher.
Yeah, so it sounds like the things that people love of, other cities, is like the Brisbane, the cottages of the Federation and the Paddington Terraces, and, in Melbourne, you've got your single fronted. And Tassie's got that, right? Like, I think people forget about that, and it's super desirable, that sort of streetscape and the beautiful tree-lined streets. And when you think about that sort of affluent, sort of, maybe double income, younger sort of family buyer that is relocating, yes, because they can maintain work or there's great work options in Tassie now. What are they sort of really driving towards? Like, what are some of the, you mentioned sort of suburban living around the sort of town centre. Let's talk about Hobart as an example. Or they sort of go for something maybe just a bit along the water that's, you know, in a quiet little pocket that's still super convenient? Is that sort of it, or is there any other things that we're sort of missing?
No, definitely it's the time piece. So it's building in with that time. But there's probably really two pieces of the puzzle. It's the ability to see water, which is really powerful. And a lot of people move here because of that. You know, you might have been, you know, on the Yarra in Melbourne or on the harbour in Sydney or those types of places. And so the water component is really, really powerful, and being able to walk to the water or see the water from your property is really powerful, or the snow on the mountain behind you. You know, when we're thinking of Hobart, right? You know, as not too dissimilar that a lot of people would want both of those from their property. Can I see the water? Can I see the mountain and full of snow in the middle of winter? And that's really what that double income, you know, middle-aged family with kids is really looking for. They're looking for the timepiece. So it's walkable to facilities, schools, waterfront. And that's traditionally where we're starting to put investors. That's the spots that investors want to be buying in. And that's where that growth really happens.
Obviously, you mentioned about the snow-capped mountain, so it's sort of hit one of my points I was keen to discuss. How do people get through the winters there? And like, how does that affect property decisions, right? Like, because locals, maybe the first year, they're like a bit, you know, gung-ho, I can survive it. But after every year, you probably want to play winters a bit smarter. You know, I spent a few years in London and Melbourne, and you start to wanting to make this period of the year enjoyable. So how do people approach property and avoid certain styles of properties just aren't going to be nice to live in through that period?
There's a couple of things that really come to mind when we look at that, and educating clients around, you know, our climate and living conditions is you're an undulating state. So there's no flat blocks. You know, you're on the side of the hill, which is great because you get great views. Orientation is really the number one thing we talk about daily here is, you know, the sun in the sky down here in Tasmania is really important. If you can get that sun, you know, that northern sun straight into your living space, you got a smile on your face pretty much, you know, 365. And it's really important in the orientations. You know, south facing is Antarctica. To put it in most people's perspective, it's cold. You know, we try and avoid south facing dwellings and really push them towards north facing. The rear of the house where the living area is, again, that's where the living of your life and that sun coming into that. But also the topography plays a huge part of it. The sun in the sky actually, you know, sits at below 45 degrees in the winter. So trying to penetrate some warmth through your house can be challenging. Our homes are timber, traditionally single glaze. 30% of them really are only renovated. So 70% original, 60s or 70s or 1920s stock. Those types of things that then, you know, nature can bring into you in topography and orientation. We talk about them day in, day out. You know, recent times in the last month of people relocating out of Sydney and Brisbane, and the house was perfect. You know, that orientation was wrong. And, you know, it was a gloomy day and we walked inside and they were just like, wow, yeah, we need that sun in here all day. And you live a great life. Beanies, jackets, scarves. Yeah, it's a beautiful life.
I think you've hit the nail on the head around topography. I mean, that's, you know, you go on a satellite and you're like, oh yeah, that's north. But no, actually it's down a hill and you're on a hillside. You're not getting any sun there. And I think, you know, the people who have got those properties that do tick that aspect, right? You know, every winter's like a pain. It's actually enjoyable. And they're like, hang on a second, I'm not selling this. The turnover rate of these properties that have got that aspect. And so if you can sort of get that, you know, you're really protected in terms of trying to sell that property in the future, right? Because you just know that there's always going to be a buyer that really wants that aspect or that piece of land. How do people think about it internally within Tasmania around Launceston, Hobart? What's better than one versus the other? Like, I'm sure there's a little bit of a battle within the state. And, you know, and what would you encourage someone to look if they were looking at Hobart or they're thinking about somewhere else in the state? How would you sort of drive their decision to different parts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I suppose I'll just take Hobart on the sun piece, right? The eastern shore or the eastern side of the river and the western side of the river is like, you know, a bona fide rivalry between each side. You know, one pretends they're at summer all year round and the other one's under the mountain and doesn't see the sun. So, you know, I think there's a few of those internal myths when you've been here for 20 years and, you know, you play that card in that property space. You get an eastern shore person who will never move to the west and vice versa. You know, they always say it's 2 or 3 degrees warmer on the other side. But I suppose, you know, like when you're relocating to the state and it's a huge part of people's lives, you know, both cities have the similar facilities. So in terms of facility need, they sort of tick the boxes there. Accessibility to Melbourne and Sydney, you know, I think they both tick the boxes there. It's really around like a lot of heritage and events and hospitality that really drives a lot of that. You know, most people who are really relocating here are continuing holding their jobs, but it's really that lifestyle piece. Launceston is an inland city. Yes, it's on a river, but it's an inland city, so it is actually a little bit warmer through the summer periods. But vice versa, it's actually a little bit colder through the winter periods. Not in terms of snow, but just generalized temperature throughout the year. Hobart, is more pleasant, 9 out of the 12 months of the year, and it will have that extreme snow, coldness, and crisp through that time. We working with some sporting organisations that have opened up here in the state and understanding that blue sky, 10 to 12 degrees is the middle of winter. So it's not like rain and snow. But I think that's really the difference between when you're investing or even, owner-occupier really in the state is, a bit of lifestyle play between the two cities. Hobart being a larger population, 2.5 of the population of Launceston, provides, those hospitality and lifestyle factors to just a fraction higher level.
How do you think the Tassie Devils AFL team, was that like a missing ingredient in the city? And do you think that's actually quite big news?
I think part of our chat today is really understanding on the ground local in buying property. And, over the last couple of days, I've been fortunate to spend 2 days with the AFL in Tasmania and their team and their sort of leadership team and working around how do we relocate hundreds of people to the state over the next 4 years before we start to, bounce the ball in the middle, and what type of properties are they looking at, and how do we house these, these wonderful athletes and so they can live a great life down here. The announcement of the AFL stadium late last year, in our business, we saw extraordinary pent-up demand. Melbourne investors were probably high on the cards than any other state. And, that flowed through to December, January. The spend, is going to be $1.5 billion in terms of just building the stadium. But we were talking Monday and Tuesday, really, that might be only 30% of the entire spend. We could expend out to $5+ billion in terms of private spend and, restaurants and transport that's going to supply to that. We're talking to a lot of politicians and, a lot of those types of community leaders. I don't think we're going to really understand the impact to an extraordinary level on the community and property. And we can see that already driving through, investors coming through our doors of what the AFL do economically for the state. And Hobart's probably a good one. The stadium is based in Hobart, right on the waterfront. Unbelievable location. And you've got the 65,000 of Hobart's population sort of within walking distance of that, and as property investors, that's what we're working with, is getting people buying those investment properties with strong yields and in really core locations. So it'll be transformational. We're a first mover at the moment once it's just been announced. You can imagine once the build phase happens and then obviously once the footy stage actually happens as well.
Not that Tassie needed more tourism, but, you got to think about that, right? The season's pretty long and, a lot of people coming to Tassie. A great little, explore a new cracking stadium, place you haven't really been, support your team. Great, easy to get to. And so I think that's quite big news. Is there anything else that you think about the state that's lacking? Like that, is it infrastructure or roads, or do you find that there's any major projects that are also like that are going to unlock a bit of extra sort of livability?
There's 3 or 4 really key projects that are really earmarked over the short to medium term, really is that stadium. There's a lot of talk, there's a couple of AI centres that are starting to come out of the ground at the moment. And that's around the topography and also our climate. That's really driving that. The availability to water and availability to cool climate is enabling those artificial intelligence community to start building their data centres here. We're working with investors from, Europe about, building data centres here and acquiring land for that. So there's probably, stadium and that AI. We've also got a Marinus link, which is our power transformation from our hydropower over to Victoria and vice versa back here. And that's going to be with a billion with a 2 in front of it somewhere along the line in the next sort of 5 years. And then we've got some big projects, upgrading the Tasman Bridge in Hobart and some infrastructure roads. So that bridge is earmarked sort of 2040. And, that will be extraordinary change and open up, more land in terms of investors to be able to get to their locations quicker and bring jobs in. So in terms of spend on sort of what's already in the pipeline, I think it's just early $20,000 to $25,000 per capita being spent in the state, which is extraordinary numbers, on a population of just sub 600,000 people.
Obviously, agents probably didn't know what you were when you started. Then they got very skilled up in knowing that there's lots of buyers agents out there probably who were based all over the country and were buying property sight unseen, I'm sure, in that boom. How does that sort of help you now, right? Sort of they're all gone and you're sort of still there pounding the pavement. How's those sort of relationships with agents sort of built over the years and help you now?
Relationships, as we know, in any industry don't happen overnight. And I was only chatting to a client the other day. They're like, oh, how do you work with these people? And, asking for access of property. And I said, oh, it's really easy. So, at 10:30, we grab a coffee down the road outside the office, and there's 5 other agencies just all in a line. And there's 25 of us at the coffee shop, and we're just chatting through like what's happening and what's the market going. And, that's how relationships here are built. That time piece enables us to spend time with them and really get access to, great property for clients, in the right spot at the right time. So those relationships are built. We're a very small population. So we work really hard. Property's a two-way street. They need us to buy and we need them to buy off. So it's a kind, we treat them really kindly. They're part of our intimate network. We talk to 20 or 30% of them every week. It's accessible, and they really understand what a buyer's agent and what we're doing to help them along as well. And it's a double-edged sword. They need assistance selling some things, and we can come across the table and help them out. And in this case, because we've been here so long, buying for sort of 5 or 6 years here, but being here for 20 years, a lot of the agents are using us as advisory piece. I might have some listings that are too high, and what a buyer's looking for. And I suppose that just shows the intricacies and on the ground, knowledge that we're doing and working in the property space as a whole.
Yeah, I reckon there's parts of Australia where, you see someone, you're probably highly likely never to bump into them again. There's parts of Australia where you probably get a bump into them this afternoon. I think that's a key part, right? Because the reality is an agent wants to have a great relationship and knows only shooting themselves in the foot if they don't also. And particularly as you get runs on the board after a few years and go, actually, they're doing a really good job for their clients and they really understand the market. And I'm sure every year that you do it, you get more and more trust and confidence with the agents and, get better and better opportunities. And, and people obviously think, oh, if there's a relationship there, it's not going to be because it's good for the clients. And absolutely it is, right? Like, when a cracking asset comes, you're more likely to get a look in, and they know you're not going to stuff them around. If there's a deal to be done, then you're not going to fall over on them. Is there anything on the state level that catches interstate buyers out, whether they're, in legals? You mentioned the property maintenance thing and renovation thing could be a big one in recent years, but anything else that you find that people get burnt just because they don't know what they don't know?
There's a couple of really cool, interesting components of our sort of property law that sets us apart from the rest of the country. We're still on a paper-based conveyancing system, so PECS is not part of our conveyancing system. So understanding that process, settlement process is really important. And then also the buyer disclosure. So there's no buyer disclosure rules here, and it's classified as a buyer's beware state. So, when you're navigating a DIY or you're trying to invest on your own, the due diligence piece of the puzzle is extraordinary. And being able to access that information in a timely manner to make those clear and defiable decisions is really important. And I'll probably just call out a recent sort of an investor who did it on their own, actually came to us, midway through the purchase in panic because some things had come to light that they didn't know how to manage. And because we're a paper-based local government councils and conveyancing systems, to get data out of them, you're not just clicking a button there. You have to run into the file and put it on the scanner and then email it across to us, right? So it's a different world. And to actually look at a property and know it complies with council regulations or building regulations, that can take 14 to 21 days to get that information out of a council. And once a property has settled, the council will actually review that property once it's sold and then see if it actually meets the council regulations. And if it doesn't, they will actually tend the property and then, ask that new owner to maybe pull down that deck because it's not approved or remove this dwelling or things of the like. So, this client actually came to us mid-purchase and said, hey, there's a deck being built and it's above 1.5 meters and how do I know it's approved? I mean, without that on the ground experience, without that knowledge, it's frightening, I think, for if you're investing and putting your hundreds and hundreds of thousands into a property and partial that property could be removed, without your consent and without the regulations and everything behind it. So buyer beware is a really important, understanding of buyers in the state. And as an advocate, right, I'm working on, you don't want to do yourself out of a job, but, I'm more advocating on the people buying property in general in Tasmania. And if we can overcome some of these and have systems in place with the government, so we're working with them to how do we get this information out to a lot of buyers to make it more accessible and safe for them to buy. But they're probably the real big ones is that, we're a paper-based and a bit of a slower conveyancing system and understanding that. But then the due diligence and getting access to that information, is critical and timely through that process. So it's tough when you're looking at if you're from the outside and never done it.
Well, you spoke around, obviously, Launceston and Hobart a bit. Is there any other pockets that have sort of got quite a fast-growing sort of part to Tassie that, people often, the longer they're there, they're like, oh, I sort of really like that pocket, and I'm happy to, commute to sort of, Launceston or Hobart when I want to go to events or see my mates? Like, is there another pocket that, is getting more and more discovered each year?
It's probably to do with topography a little bit that's happening, and then lifestyle and beach. So an hour outside of Launceston, there's a pocket sort of Devonport, Ulverston, and you're sort of pegged between sort of three small river outlets going into the Bass Strait. Median price is sort of, in the mid fives, so it's accessible to a lot of people. But just that lifestyle piece, you're an hour from you can drive into Launceston and go to work, which is very common, believe it or not, for a lot of people on that coast. But the lifestyle's extraordinary. You can go snow skiing, you can go mountain bike riding, you can go deep sea fishing, you can do these lifestyle factors. It's the investor piece of the puzzle that has been really buoyant through that area. Great land size, good density, and people happily living in that density as well. So some really good upside through there. But, Devonport right the way through to Penguin. And there's a little pocket that agriculture is really enormous on the northwest coast. And it's a real key driver of GDP and economic in the state. And the age bracket of farmers now is getting to that retirement stage, and a lot of them are relocating in, which is sucking up a lot of supply, which is vacancy rates are very low, good dwelling supply, is very tight through there. So investors are really enjoying some of those areas. But again, all streets aren't the same. You've got to really understand that local knowledge. I lived in Devonport for 6 or 7 years. So knowing that and living in those areas, is really important to navigate. But yeah, that's a really interesting pocket. I'd say that's up north. And then a really interesting pocket down south is like, a little place called Snug and Margate. It's about an hour or 45 minutes out of Hobart. Lifestyle beyond belief, right? It's similar to the Hawkesbury, but more a Tasmanian flavour and acreage lots. Really convenient to drive back in, 45 an hour back into the city to live. They're sort of key pockets that have really, exploded in the last 3 to 5 years.
Obviously, driving it's the family market. It's the sort of pre-retiree market as well. Kids have left home, the empty nesters that still need to work for a bit. It's the early retirees, like that still got a lot of living and want to explore and get in nature. And so, yeah, often they don't need to be in the city centre, right? And they're happy to just travel. And so the more they sort of live down there, they explore, they look at different pockets. And so I think it's, a state where you definitely want to look at those options from an investment point of view and a home buying down there as well. But you need to have that sort of knowledge. I think the further you start stepping away, also you've got to know the local market even more so, because, that market will move to different sort of paces. So thanks so much for coming on. And, as you can sort of see through this episode, so much experience here and local knowledge. It's just so important in the Tassie market, and really appreciate your time, David.
Lovely, Chris. Love chatting. Thanks again.
Thanks so much for listening today. We hope you got lots of value out of it. If you'd like to speak to our guest today, there's links in the show notes on how you can get in contact. And if you're buying your first home, upgrading, renovating, or need any finance-related queries, obviously we'd love to help. There's links in the show notes to us as a mortgage broker, and we look forward to next week's episode.